issues within institutions. Like Bunnell is such a good example of thinking through and continually being in process, and working in decolonizing ways toward these better futures that we keep thinking of, and really an artist-centered place that really respects where you are located and local community, as well as Indigenous artists from across Alaska and beyond. So as we think about these structures, and I always, we think about what needs to be fixed and changed. I think it's also really good to also really look to places and people that are doing work well, and think about ways we can amplify and also learn from, and yeah.
Emily, I'm so sorry I disappeared there for a moment. I lost my signal, and you're so nimble, and everyone else so patient. I just want to encourage others to check out the video on their own. It's always incredibly clunky to try and share a video on Zoom, because what actually happened was I didn't realize that I was muting the room, but I was also muting the video. So I forgot that you can't mute yourself. But there's these little dogs running in and out of the room and things like that, which I thought weren't necessary to include. Anyway, it's just crazy. But I want to thank you for your patience with all of this, and to also thank you for your acknowledgement of the work that we're trying to do. It's an ongoing work. It's a commitment to constant learning, isn't it? To really to be accountable to Alaska's history, to be responsible, to be responsive to artists, and really what that means, leaning into artists' work, allowing artists to lead that work is really what it means. I'm so happy to have many artists with whom we've been thrilled to work together. Mariah Maloney from Homer, so great to see you, in your dance, and to bring your dance to Bunnell, and of course, Rika and Nancy Lord and Hollis Mickey and many others, present here today are people who have shared in this space where it's really becoming about learning together. It's really becoming about responding, I would say, to the possibility of creating the best world we can. And it's so deeply inspired by the work that you're doing, Emily, to listen, to really listen. So we were minutes ago, trying to share this lovely short doc that was made by Jacob's Pillow about your residency there. And I wanted to ask you, you might have spoken about this and I might have missed it when I disappeared there for a moment, about what was going on. So you came to Jacob's Pillow to progress the work of Being Future Being, and you are doing that work in constellatory relationship with the trees and your environment. But looking around, you see these signs, and remind us, because we're not going to go into the video, people can do that on their own, but remind us what these signs said on the land that kind of sets up the crux of the issues that you're bringing forth in Being Future Being.
Jacob's Pillow is, it's on a gorgeous campus in the Berkshires on Nipmuc, Agawam, and Mohican land, and it's a gorgeous place, and also the program and staff and everybody there was and is so supportive, and somehow made these bubble residencies. So my collaborator and I, quarantined, and they set up the testing with the doctor here in New York, and so we had we could dance and we could work in like in old times, close to one another and without masks, and it was just us on campus, and it was really a generative time and really wonderful. And then also on campus there are these signs as you walk in that say, this was originally so-and-so's farm in so-and-so year, and et cetera, and it just it was such, it really, I had been to Jacob's Pillow campus before, but had had not seen that sign. I was there once in nighttime and hadn't seen the sign. And it was just so interesting to be in this like really like you know, that kind of space, like when you're hot and it's like you're less like this there's less solidness between you and the air, you know, you're just kind of like expanding and growing. And it felt like that. It felt like we had been with the trees and we've been with each other and these scholars and like really like thinking and moving and like you know, I was in the woods for the first time because I've been here in New York City all of COVID and mostly and so it just felt expansive. And then it was like we were like smacked with the sign that said this was originally a farm. Like it quite actually felt like that. It just felt like, and it just like stripped all that magic away and was just like, this again, you know. And you just, I think what the point that I make in the documentary is that we get used to it. We get used to things like this. We get used to the first thing of as my friend Andrea Carlson joked on a tweet recently, the first thing of colonization, right? Like, yeah, there was nothing here until it was a farm, and now it's this gorgeous residency. And so I just had a chat with Pam, the director, about how that felt, and just about really the opportunity it presents to make a good change. To they're already in relationship with their local community, local Indigenous community, and already have people who they can start to begin a conversation with about, all right, like we've recognized this now and recognize that this is harmful and also not true. So what can the change be, you know? And they can really start that conversation with people and come into something that maybe, I mean, who knows what people locally will want, but it's really up to them, because it is their land. And I think that will just bring everyone who comes to then Jacob's Pillow into a better relationship, right?
Yeah.
With the place, you know, and a better relationship with reality, and with the culture and the art and the history that has always been there long before that place was a farm, you know. And that's the generative nature of that place comes from that. It doesn't come from the colonizing history. And so, and now actually, you know, after I left, and probably many of you know, the theater there burned, and so now they'll be rebuilding. And
Wow.
I've talked with Pam since too, to say, oh, actually this, like, you could start this now in a really good way with local community folks, with local Indigenous folks, like before the rebuild. Start that conversation, and there might be there might, like, something there will be different outcomes when things are done in good relationships.
That fire is weirdly you know, coincident and similar to the whole experience of COVID and how it's swept our stages and how it's affected performance, you know, internationally. And so if we could just pivot to the impact of the work that you're doing in a systemic way to build change. It's off of what is like a fire, you know, these times, and to view the opportunity of creating new futures for performance through the lens of reciprocity and respect for performance artists, and the commitments that presenters make to artists when they contract, and then are faced with really challenging times where stages are closed. Could you talk a little bit about how your work as an artist has shaped this dialogue that you found yourself in the center of for a while? And although, you know, there are many other people now who are working and leading that work, maybe you could talk a little bit about how being Future Being, in some ways, being Emily Johnson, inspired creating new futures and that movement that's so powerful today.
I mean, one of the, when you come into a new year and some people do resolutions and things, I don't necessarily do that, but I do try to kind of take measure of where I am and what I want to really be focusing on in the coming time. And I won't tell you everything that I was thinking about coming into 21, but one of them was justice for all beings. And I mean, that's not that I mean, that's just, it's necessary. It is, it's necessary that we as individuals and communities, families, organizations, people, that we create justice, that we are in just relationships, and that we build that together. And sometimes that does mean fighting, like fighting systems and fighting oppressions, certainly. And sometimes it means creating something new. And so then again, we come into the possibility part, right? But actualizing some of those possibilities. So I think that, creating new futures was really born of a time of unjustness, artists losing their livelihoods, their commissions, their contracts, their opportunities, and together, a group of us really just started to come together to think about and write about that. And as you said, there's a phase 2 working group that's been working on that for a few months now, and hopefully it will continue to grow. But it was really for me, the part that I wrote in that original document, Creating New Futures document, was really about the possibility. Like, so faced with these unjust cancellations, and not to say that organizations weren't having a hard time. Certainly organizations and presenters, everyone's having a hard time trying to figure out where funding would come from, what might happen. If we can all remember, back then we didn't know we hardly knew anything about COVID or about what would come in the next coming month. And so I think the initial rush of presenters, which was the result of canceling everything, I think that was rushed. I think that artists are people who can help us through moments of crisis and moments of transition. And so I actually at that moment was really thinking of, I think this is actually dangerous to shut the ideas down of artists. I actually thought that would actually harm our path forward. And the way that I took the little section that I compiled for that co-compiled document was really about what could have been the alternatives to those cancellations. So I spoke with many artists across what's called the United States, as well as presenters, some of whom were also working on alternatives to cancellations within their organizations and their programming. But as COVID, we all know it continues to very distinctly highlight the white supremacist roots of all governing structures of this country, including our nonprofit systems, and arts and cultural systems and institutions. And so I think we have both a responsibility, we have a distinct responsibility right now, as well as an amazing opportunity to drastically shift the way forward. To me, I really was a proponent of not reopening, of cultural institutions not reopening, unless there was a somehow a proven or a somehow documented process that they were anti-racist process that that those institutions and organizations were going through. I think there's still room and time to do this. There's obviously a rush right now to reopen in whatever way that means, even if that's on digital and Zoom. But I think that we do ourselves and our future generations a great disservice if we rush into a reopening without a reckoning with what happened, not only in the cultural sphere, but in all spheres. As we know, COVID has the most deathly effect on Indigenous and Black and other people of color, and our reservations and our small communities are being really hard hit by COVID and by death because of the systemic inequalities that those communities had already been oppressed by. So that's what has to be, that's what we need to, that's what we have the moral ethical responsibility to work on. And I think that the work of creating new futures and also the work of so many artists and stories and thinking is to push that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems to be, it's you've created an opportunity as a movement to reflect on the deeper work that seems to be pervasive within BIPOC artists, and that is about thinking differently in relationship to land, in relationship to the structures that are built on or with or through that land. And in this moment, in this sort of fiery moment when the structures have, many of them have in a figurative sense burned down, and some are just smoldering, and some have little sparks where artists like yourself offer their light to a place like Manel. You know, we're really thinking deeply about that soil of like strategic planning and structure that will yield greater reciprocity within our widespread community. I want to acknowledge again that there's many artists. Oh, go ahead, please, Emily, go ahead.
We can be radical in that thought, you know, like to me, like, you know, museums that still hold our ancestors and our belongings, you know, I think everything should be returned. Everything needs to go back, and then Indigenous communities decide how and in what ways and what belongings and what artists are you know, represented. If we even want to ever reopen a museum, you know, like that, like, yeah. So I love to encourage the again, the possibility, you know. You
seize the opportunity to acknowledge that work. And I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of different artists and people engaged with institutions on this call, and invite people to you know, share questions. Nancy asked if we can access the New Futures document, and I'll let you respond to that, Emily. I know that you can. It's a work in progress, but yes, thank you for sharing that link. And if there's other questions that people have about this work, creating new futures, being future being, and Emily's work, this is a great time to ask. And of course, go ahead, Mariah, did you have a question?
I just wanted to say how wonderful it is to be here. And Asia, thank you so much. Emily, it's wonderful to hear about the processes, the experiences, and also just to be together in this time. I felt that way. So ironic that being in a screen together can really feel so intimate. Just wanting to say thank you. Yeah.
I'm glad you bring that up, Mariah, in the ways that we are trying to huddle up,
this, we lean into our screens, into these calls and spaces where we can connect. And that's doing something that's certainly strengthening for me. And I think it's been strengthening to Benel and our community. But it also, when artists share like little snippets, whether it's like that small dance that you did on the beach, Mariah, just, quite recently, you brought us all down to the shore. Emily, when you take us into the woods, in Vermont, and we can be with you, something bigger is happening, something different that wasn't happening before. And I just want to, hand it to you for giving, for really leaning into the new ways that we can connect and structure. It's a really different constellation, I feel like, that will emerge. And it's part of the new futures.
Yeah.
It is.
But Karen, we've been talking so much about the invitation. My colleague Karen McLeod, I mentioned earlier, like, yeah, the invitation to gather, whether that's at the beach, in these Zoom calls, at a collective fire, or at your own individual fire with a candle, like what or to, death to museums, or to what the invitation is.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, like, we've been really struck with how much we're paying attention to the invitation in a different way.
That's right. And sometimes, especially in spaces like these, it's very funny when there's sort of or awkward a moment of silence. But that is when we are, not being authoritative about like what the question is or should be and who should talk. There's a sort of leveling that's happening that really, when I was a child, my mother was interviewing Indigenous Alaskans, and those were slow, quiet, and really thoughtful spaces. There was a lot of silence that just had to do with letting thoughts form, and we need to make space for that. That's a structural change that is quite a contrast to the fast clip of everything from editing and sharing and interacting, in the society that has been our long-standing Western legacy. If anybody else has a question or comment, I really, urge you to seize this opportunity. Hollis, what are you thinking?
Hi. Yeah, I guess, so Emily, I'm so grateful to connect again. And, I think you're bringing up some points that I think we, in the cultural nonprofit sector as a whole, this morning, my colleagues and I were on a 2-hour sort of professional development moment about dismantling structural racism. And I guess I'm just really thinking, though, about how embedded it is in the system of cultural nonprofits, like how structural inequity is just baked into the way that cultural nonprofits work, and also how toxic it is because there's the illusion that they're serving everyone, or that there's like they're in service. In some regard, like it feels more approachable to me in a corporate structure because it's inherently, it's visibly capitalist. It's admitting kind of those goals. And I guess I just wondered a little bit about some of your more radical thoughts around what that could look like. What are options, or if there are models that you've seen or models you've imagined, I think is something that I'm curious to hear from you, because
Oh wait, you're muted right now.
We lost you for a second there.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
I think just the ability to see out of the existing model is something that I think there's such need for. And I'm just curious about ideas that you have, or dismantlings that you imagine.
Yeah. One thing that, what I really look forward to is in these conversations and others, finding what those paths are. I mean, I certainly don't have any answers, but something that comes to mind, which might relate, is I was speaking with somebody recently about let's see, how do I set this up? I was speaking with somebody recently about a systemic issue that I'm having with an institution, and that I want to share the story of, and in the hopes of ending that, of like cutting ties with that relationship, but also and doing that in a way that is protective and healthy for me and my collaborators, but also that could be in service, right, to the field, not as in a pointing fingers, look at what I think is bad that happened and violent and racist that happened, but look at what happened and what is a different kind of what are solutions, what are alternate pathways to prevent this from happening again to anyone else, and also what could have been done differently to shift this situation as it was happening. And so I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about so many artists who have these kinds of situations and stories that they have and or are experiencing. And so I'm thinking of ways to bring maybe other artists into that conversation, so that we're sharing that labor, but then also it's bringing up more uplifting, more stories. But part of that conversation, we started thinking about, the power always lies really, honestly, within the institution, within the structure, within the nonprofit structure or the for-profit structure, because the funnel of funding, however big or small that funnel is, that's where that funding goes to, and then there's this trickle-down funding to eventually maybe to artists or to the communities that different nonprofits serve. So, to me, I always think we're not really going to shift things until funders and also audiences stop supporting that system and stop supporting that system and stop supporting institutions that continue unethical behavior. So how do we bring audiences into this gathering when there's no show, when it's about systems change? How do we bring audiences into this process so they are really part of the voice too of not standing by, and again, not supporting unethical behavior, and maybe have solutions or pathways or ideas for themselves too. And one tangible thing certainly is that funders could actually stop that flow of money to institutions. I mean, it could shift completely and radically that communities, and that's what was called for all summer, right, in Black communities, that Black communities should have the resources to determine their health and their safety and their well-being. So communities, our BIPOC communities, most urgently, our Indigenous and Black communities, most urgently, our Indigenous and Black people and artists, most urgently, are the ones who should be resourced to self-determine what is next for ourselves. And so I think if funders, that's one radical solution or one radical idea of mine, is just if funders stop funding institutions.
Well, and it is really changing what funders are funding. I'm just thinking about what's happened this summer with Mellon, funding artist relief, with McKnight lifting up Indigenous artist residencies, with WestAF, creating the Resilience Fund to incentivize the focus on BIPOC equity within the programming of, the nonprofits that they fund. So there's, I think, the majority of money is still really grounded in old white systems. But it is interesting to see, I think, how, as you say, funders can sort of turn the ship by sort of offering these trade winds that are completely, appropriate and refreshing in our directions toward equity and inclusion. That is absolutely happening, and I know you've been really a part of that from the beginning of those dialogues, because you've got long-standing relationships with really important leaders in funding who actually become thought leaders. New England Foundation for the Arts, for example, and long-standing policymakers who are shaping this landscape.
We need to listen to the individuals and the communities that I was speaking of before. Listen and know, and then follow through.
Yeah.
Right? And I think we need to like a little bit sweep away this thought that this is like all those changes that you mentioned, and the relief funds, like all highly necessary, but again, also like they're kind of they're a momentary
Right.
aid. So I mean, how do we I'm very interested in what is this future in which we redesign and we're in a different kind of systemic structure completely.
Yeah.
Even what I just said, about funders changing their models, that leaves the funders in place. I think eventually probably that needs to shift. And so what does that, what possibility creates there? Like, we know that we take care of we know that mutual aid exists outside of systemic structures, because systemic structures always monopolize and always corrupt those kinds of systems, right? And so that's why our kinship and our conciliatory relationships and practices are so vital. And I'm curious about when those relationships are resourced and centered, like, and then really listened to. Yeah, what further can that shift beyond what I can imagine at this moment?
Yeah, totally. Hollis, please share your question from Melissa Shaganoff. Thank you.
Yeah,
Emily.
I'm glad to unmute and ask it on her behalf. She just texted me. So Melissa is wondering if, Emily, if you can think of a time when you had to explain to funders or institutions that they needed to extend some bravery and give power away. Maybe you can offer an example or tell a story.
Hi, Melissa. Thanks for listening. When they've had to extend bravery and give power away, yes. So two things come to mind. One is that I was on a Zoom call with Maureen Knighton from Doris Duke. Is that right? Oh my gosh, my mind at the moment. And this was the conversation. This was the conversation to and really around creating new futures, because some funders helped to support that process after it had begun. And I was really conscious, and we were really conscious as a group at that time to speak to this with these funders, to, while we needed to accept support, to also say, we need you in this fight with us. So how can you as a funder reimagine and redirect your power, your resource, and do that in a way that maybe you've never quite visioned before. And that, of course, the issue there is that every funder then has a whole board that has to also be swayed and shifted, right? So there's always a bigger power to be found, right? So it's not like talking with the director of a funding institution. They're usually ready and wanting to make big shifts, but then they also have power structures that they're dealing with. And so we've been having that conversation with some funders. And then I remember very clearly a really great conversation with oh my gosh, test of your memory. You know, when you're like standing next to somebody and you know them, and then you're like, oh my gosh, your name just totally blanked for me. Susan from Mellon Foundation. We were just forgetting last name at the moment, but we were in a long conversation about funding this process of developing a network to support Indigenous performing artists. And we do have support, some seed support for that network, which is great. But it has been a really ongoing and long conversation. I remember at one point in that conversation, and I was just really honest with her. I was like, I know that you have a process within your foundation, and you need to, talk to those other people, and you need to get this into that board meeting, and you need to have that conversation, and you need to vet certain things, and I understand that. But while you do that, there are people on reservations, young people who are committing suicide. There are people in communities where I come from back home who are missing, who are murdered, who are being sexually trafficked. There are people who are being harmed because of the extractive industries that oppress so many Indigenous communities. Not that this network that I'm part of helping would fix those things, but our stories do. And so the stories, all of the First Nations and Indigenous artists whose stories, whose dances, whose processes haven't been uplifted because that resource and that support has not been there, like in this country as a whole. Like the longer that we wait for those stories, the more harm gets done. The sooner that we can bring those stories, those future stories, those past stories, as soon as the sooner and the more fully and wholly that we can bring those stories in the way that artists want to bring them to ourselves and our world, and our people back home can see themselves reflected in different ways and start to be engaged in those healing processes, and the ways in which that confronts, old-fashioned and stereotypical images and ideas that white supremacists have of Indigenous nations and cultures and people and ways of being. Like that is a healing process forward. So I had that conversation with Susan because I was like, I understand, but while you wait, this is the reality. And it's true.
Yeah. You are, I want to acknowledge the kind of courage that it takes to speak up that way, and the changes that you're making, the ripples that is having. And Melissa too, she is doing that work and creating change in that process, suggesting that the table needs to be expanded, that more people need to come to the table, and that the job of curators might be to ask artists what they need rather than telling them how they fit into the designs that curators have, is absolutely game changing and really, truly relevant and important right now. So,
and I want to acknowledge Melissa's work, within institutions. It's a challenge. It can be such a challenging place to be. I've been really thinking about that a lot this morning via another meeting that I was in. The ways in which, the ways in which, for example, our belongings and ancestors held within walls and cases and drawers and institutions. More and more artists and others are being asked to activate or be part of, different exhibits, and I think that's definitely a good first step. And as someone who's being asked that and being asked to be an activator, like I also acknowledge that that's like a, like I want to bust the cases open and send everything home. and while maybe that is not quite possible yet, what can I do that is respectful and giving enough, and offering to ancestors, to belongings, what I can, and offering to audiences and people coming in the real, the I don't know, the pain, or the reality of what it means to keep our ancestors and belongings in these kinds of holdings. So that's just one example of being within an institution and like not being able to quite smash out of it, right? But like wanting to, but like what, so, and I know that Melissa does so much work that is really generative and brings community in and also pushes out through the walls, and that I know that's also can be challenging.
Yeah. Well, you know, the idea of smashing cases and boxes, it reminds me too of just like the role, you know, I mean, every once in a while people get super frustrated and violence comes up, but when you speak about it, just to talk about, and Melissa has as well, talked about the power of allowing elders to hold their objects, allowing people to share their stories and to make the repairs and to interact with these works that are held, you know, and totally sort of controlled by, you know, preparators and curators, and separated in that way from the people to whom they originally belong. That's very powerful. I think those stories, and hearing those stories, are having an increasing impact. I want to acknowledge that. I really do.
I've seen little kids up in Quinnipiac, you know, like holding on to librettes and like putting up here and like checking out, you know, like just that too, you know. It's it's bringing kids and young people into like that like tangible like connection, you know.
Yeah.
It's real. Yeah.
Emily, thank you so much. You've been really generous with your time today, and to all of you who've stuck with us through the usual array of technical difficulties, reminding us that just staying connected and like being patient and continuing to listen and hold this space is such a powerful thing. Thank you so much.
Great to see you all. Kriana, thank you.
Kriana.
Thank you so much.